Hello and welcome. My name is Michael Ahmad. I'm a physical and cybersecurity analyst here at Texas RE. And as part of our Reliability 201 suite, I'm going to be talking about security patch management. Here is our antitrust admonition. Feel free to read through this. And if you have any questions, please contact Texas RE's General Counsel. Taking a look at the agenda for today, we're going to be talking about CIP 7-6R2, which is the primary standard requirement which relates to patch management. We'll also talk about some topics of consideration, examples, and we'll finish up with some resources which may be helpful. But first, we'll take a moment to talk about why we're here. Vulnerabilities in software and hardware continue to pose a significant risk to the bulk electric system. A 2025 report from the threat intelligence vendor Flashpoint indicated that time to exploit has plummeted from 745 days in 2020 to just 44 days in 2025. While zero-day attacks, which take advantage of vulnerabilities that the vendor is unaware of, remain a concern, the primary driver of this trend is end-day attacks, which relate to vulnerabilities that have been publicly disclosed but remain unpatched by organizations. This means that cybersecurity and IT professionals have a much smaller window to patch vulnerabilities than they did just 5 years ago. Adding to this concern, the prevalence of the use in AI in generating and delivering malicious code has made exploiting vulnerabilities easier than ever for attackers. To touch on some high-profile attacks, we've got DarkSword, which affects older versions of Apple's iOS. Now, this is a watering hole attack that moves from the browser to full kernel access simply by visiting a web page. Apple reports that this vulnerability impacts 15 to 20% of active iPhones, affecting millions of users. And this is all a result of people running outdated versions of iPhone's iOS. Around the globe, we've got government organizations dealing with the TrueChaos attacks on the TrueConf video conferencing service. This has resulted in command and control, or C2 frameworks, to be installed, intelligence to be gathered, and operations to be disrupted. And here in the United States, the Citrix NetScaler bug has allowed attackers to steal session cookies and perform session hijacking on critical infrastructure, notably healthcare. Now, this bug is reminiscent of the Citrix Bleed attacks from the last few years and remains a significant concern. The Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, or CISA, assigned this vulnerability a criticality score of 9.3 out of 10 and directed federal agencies to apply security patches within just 10 days of the exploit being disclosed. Here we can see some notable statistics regarding the prevalence of CIP 7 noncompliance. As you can see from the graph on the left, the two most commonly reported noncompliance in 2025 were CIP 10 and CIP 7, which involve high volume and high frequency conduct. CIP 7-6R2 requires entities to implement a documented patch management process to be used for tracking, evaluating, and installing cybersecurity patches, or otherwise creating and executing a plan to mitigate the risks posed by these vulnerabilities. Where CIP 10 shares common ground with CIP 7 is that it involves implementing a change management process, which can include the installation of patches. Now, the graph on the right shows the risk level of the noncompliance reported in 2025. As you can see, although CIP 10 noncompliance was more commonly reported, CIP 7 actually had twice as many instances of noncompliance with a moderate risk. This means that roughly 18% of the noncompliance reported for CIP 7 constituted a moderate risk, and approximately 8% of CIP 10 noncompliance constituted a moderate risk. Now, these numbers fluctuate from year to year, but CIP 7 is heavily represented among the risks to the bulk power system, going as far back as 2018. And that's why we're here. These challenges provide an opportunity to strengthen patch management processes and procedures, and implementing a strong CIP 7 program is essential in maintaining the security of the grid. Let's take a moment to go over the purpose of CIP 7-6, which is to manage system security by specifying select technical, operational, and procedural requirements in support of protecting BES cyber systems against compromise that could lead to misoperation or instability in the bulk electric system, or BES. CIP 7 doesn't just address patch management, but includes requirements that address accessible ports, which is part of requirement R1, the mitigation of malicious code, which is covered in requirement R3, and the logging of events, which is broken down in requirement R4. But our focus today will be digging into the different parts of requirement R2. One important thing to note is the applicability of requirement R2. R2 applies to high impact and medium impact facilities, and specifically the BES cyber systems within these facilities, as well as their associated ECMs, PACs, and PCAs. These groupings all have NERC-specific definitions, and those definitions can be found in the NERC glossary of terms, but I'll briefly paraphrase them here. BES cyber systems are comprised of one or more BES cyber assets, which are the equipment used to operate the grid. This can be any cyber asset that, if rendered unavailable or misused, could adversely impact the reliability of the BES. ECMs, which stands for Electronic Access Control or Monitoring Systems, represents the network equipment used to manage electronic access to our BES cyber systems. This could be anything from a firewall to authentication servers, jump hosts, and intrusion detection or prevention systems. PACs are our physical access control systems. These are network devices that control physical access to BES cyber systems and would include things like badge readers, biometric scanners, and door control panels. And finally, PCAs. PCA stands for Protected Cyber Assets. And while these devices are not cyber assets, they do connect to the same network as cyber assets using a routable protocol and could thus indirectly affect the reliability of the grid if compromised. There's a wide range of equipment that could be considered a PCA, but some examples would include file servers, networked printers, and time servers. Understanding the applicability of R2 helps us understand the rationale behind the requirement. What we are protecting is not just the network devices that directly operate the grid, but also the devices which protect them electronically and physically, as well as devices on their network that could provide lateral movement to BES cyber assets or otherwise affect the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the communication that the BES relies on. There are 4 requirement parts of CIP 7-6R2. And on the next few slides, we'll dig into the specifics of each part one by one. Just like constructing a house, these 4 parts build upon each other to form a comprehensive framework for patch management. Okay, so part 2.1 requires responsible entities to implement a documented process for tracking, evaluating, and installing cybersecurity patches. So what are cybersecurity patches in this context? The requirement covers patches that involve security fixes and that handle a specific vulnerability in a hardware or software product. The standard also specifies the requirement for tracking, and that it must include the identification of a source or sources used for patching. Some security patches may have different sources. For example, a patch may be released from an original source, such as an operating system vendor, but require approval by another source, such as a control system vendor, before they can be applied to the control system without negatively affecting security of the control system. Documentation of the patch source in the tracking portion of the process, whether the operating system vendor or the control system vendor, is required to determine when the assessment timeframe for part 2.2 starts. We'll talk about that in a moment, but first let's take a look at some examples of evidence and topics of consideration for part 2.1. All right. Some examples of evidence to demonstrate compliance with requirement R2, part 2.1, include patch management process document and a list of monitored sources for cybersecurity patches. Patch management process documents should include the steps that entities take to execute the tracking, evaluation, and installation of cybersecurity patches, and lists of monitored sources would include the locations from which patches are provisioned. Examples of monitored sources could include vendor notifications, security feeds, and vulnerability databases, such as the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, or NIST, a national vulnerability database. To the right, we've got some considerations when establishing or evaluating a CIP 7 program. Responsible entities may want to ask themselves certain questions, such as whether their patch management process includes detailed instructions, where compliance documentation is stored, and whether the process includes controls to track applicable assets. Detailed instructions within a process document can help reduce the risk that individuals who are implementing the process misunderstand or overlook certain aspects. They can help establish a clear understanding for those individuals regarding their roles within the process. The circumstances that responsible entities face can vary greatly between different entities and even different facilities. Therefore, entities may want to implement an approach that conforms to those unique circumstances and sets clear expectations to staff. The designation of a storage repository for compliance documentation, whether a file share or a ticketing system or other means, helps ensure that evidence is accessible, managed properly, and maintained for the required timeframe, regardless of staffing changes. Internal controls pertaining to tracking of applicable assets is, of course, important, as the patch management process is only beneficial if it's applied to the cyber assets which it's intended for. Okay, on to Part 2.2. Part 2.2 requires that at least once every 35 days, responsible entities evaluate security patches for applicability that have been released since the last evaluation from the source or sources identified in Part 2.1. This is where the documentation of the source or sources comes in. Going back to our previous example, the original source of a security patch may be the operating system vendor, but if the approval of the control system vendor is required, we would use the date the control system vendor approved the security patch for a 35-day timeframe, rather than the date the patch was released by the operating system vendor. One thing to consider with Part 2.2 is the establishment of controls around requirement deadlines. For example, entities may use a ticketing system for tracking the evaluation of security patches. These ticketing systems may notify pertinent staff of upcoming deadlines via email notification or require action within the ticketing systems to close out a task. Some entities may prefer to use calendar reminders, although these require updates with changes in personnel or an individual's roles and responsibilities. Regardless of the method by which evaluations are tracked, though, taking advantage of automation and reducing the risk of human error is generally advisable. Another topic of consideration is whether your program has a process to identify the end date of an evaluation. Because the standard requires that security patches be evaluated within 35 days of the date of the last evaluation, having a documented process to identify that date will help entities maintain compliance. If compliance staff looks at this as a task to complete on the same day every month, but the evaluation process takes more than one day, the fact that the evaluations are required every 35 days versus 30 days gives entities 4 to 7 days to complete the evaluation. Examples of evidence to demonstrate compliance include the evaluations themselves. This could be a signed form that is completed by compliance staff, or if an entity uses a ticketing system, a copy of the service ticket that was closed out. Okay. Part 2.3 describes the next step in the patch management process. It builds on Part 2.2 by requiring entities to take the results of the evaluations completed in Part 2.2 and address them within 35 days. The standard lists 3 types of actions that must be taken based on the result of the evaluations, and these include applying the applicable patches, creating a dated mitigation plan, or revising an existing mitigation plan. Part 2.3 also states that mitigation plans shall include the responsible entity's planned actions to mitigate the vulnerabilities addressed by each security patch and a time frame to complete those mitigations. The timeline established here in Part 2.3 will come into play in Part 2.4. The inclusion of language regarding mitigation plans is designed to handle situations in which the installation of a patch on a running system presents a greater risk than the vulnerability itself. This would usually apply to high availability systems where uptime is critical. And in instances such as this, where it is in the best interest of reliability to forego installing a security patch, entities may have the option to apply supplemental controls to mitigate the risk that the vulnerability poses. Now, on to some examples. Of course, if a patch is installed, responsible entities would want to retain records of the installation. This could be system-generated evidence from a configuration management tool, or registry exports, or other documentation that demonstrates the installation of a patch, such as a software or operating system version number. if an entity has opted to not install a patch based on availability needs, an example of evidence would include a dated plan showing when and how the vulnerability will be addressed. Now, some things to consider for Part 2.3 are listed on the table on the right. One thing to consider is how entities will verify the installation date of patches. Some examples include a screenshot showing a successful installation of the patch, accompanied by an identifier of the cyber asset as well as the date. But whether a screenshot or an export or a configuration report, a documented process for verifying the installation of patches as well as the date installed helps to ensure the evidence of installing patches is retained for compliance. Another consideration is the establishment of controls that are in place to verify that the patch was installed. For example, patches pushed through WSUS or SCCM may fail to install for a variety of reasons, such as pending updates, insufficient disk space, or inactive agents. And one last thing to consider is how mitigation plans address the risk associated with the vulnerability. As mentioned before, the inclusion of mitigation plans in the standard is intended to be applied to situations where the risk associated with the installation of a patch outweighs the risk associated with the vulnerability. However, this does not mean that the risk associated with the vulnerability is insignificant, and whether a system is patched or not, the mitigation plan must address the vulnerability. Some examples of mitigating controls could include disabling affected services, applying firewall rules, and segmenting devices by creating isolated virtual local area networks, or VLANs. And in the case of intrusion detection system, one mitigation might be increasing the frequency of logging and monitoring of security alerts, or in the case of the PACs we talked about earlier, enhancing physical security surrounding the cyber asset. The final part of requirement R2, part 2.4, requires entities to implement the mitigation plan within the timeframe specified in the plan. This excludes instances where a revision to the plan or an extension of the timeline is approved by the SIP senior manager or delegate. Now, there is no maximum time frame for the mitigation of vulnerabilities, as patching and other system changes may pose their own risk. However, it's important to note that revisions to plans and extensions of timelines should be justified and must be approved by the SIP senior manager or delegate to be considered compliant. So for some examples of evidence for Part 2.4, obviously, in an ideal world, mitigation plans will be completed within their original timeframe. In this case, an example of evidence would include records demonstrating that the mitigation plans were implemented. Going back to our previous examples of mitigation actions, this could include service disablement records, firewall configuration logs, network documentation showing that devices have been placed on separate VLANs, and that those VLANs are logically isolated from other parts of the network as needs allow. In the event that a mitigation plan was unable to be completed within the original time frame, compliance evidence could include records demonstrating that plan revisions or timeframe extensions were approved by the SIP senior manager or delegate. Some items that entities may want to consider for Part 2.4 include the tracking of mitigation plan deadlines and how implementation evidence is stored. As with other parts of this requirement, this could be in a central repository, such as a network file share or ticketing system. Entities may also want to think about the controls that ensure mitigation plans are approved by the appropriate party. A documented process for assigning a delegate to the SIP senior manager can help ensure that this process is seen to completion and help things along. So now that we've talked about all the parts in requirement R2, let's take a look at some examples of evidence. Here, on the left, we see an example of what implementation evidence may look like. These fields could be created as part of a custom form in a ticketing system or just an internal document. The form on the left demonstrates the tracking of security patches. This entry records an identifier for the cyber asset, the name of the software or hardware product, the current software or firmware version, and the patch source. The example on the right shows the continuous tracking of the status of a single patch and includes information about the patch, as well as the date of the last evaluation, which is required in Part 2.2, the date the patch was installed, as required in Part 2.3. If you look at the third row from the bottom, you'll see that this form contains evidence demonstrating the installation of the patch. In this example, it is a dated screenshot showing that the patch was applied. On this next slide, we see an example of evidence of an instance where a mitigation plan had to be created. In this example, the employee completing the form noted that the patch will not be installed due to the potential effect on reliability. They've also noted that a mitigation plan will need to be created. Now, the form on the right is dated, describes the vulnerability that the patch addresses, the cyber assets impacted by the patch, the planned actions to mitigate the risk associated with the vulnerability, and a time frame to complete the mitigations. You'll see that in this example, the entity has chosen to isolate the impacted cyber assets from the rest of the network by creating segmented VLANs. Now, note that the approval from the SIP senior manager or delegate is not required for this mitigation plan, as the plan has not been revised nor the timeline extended. So let's take a moment to review what we've talked about today. We've looked at the 4 parts that make up requirement R2 and how they build upon each other. Part 2.1 requires that entities have a process for tracking, evaluating, and installing cybersecurity patches for applicable cyber assets. Part 2.2 requires that entities evaluate cybersecurity patches for applicability at least once every 35 days. Part 2.3 requires that entities take action on the result of those evaluations within 35 days. And Part 2.4 requires that entities implement mitigation plans within the established timeframe or acquire approval from the SIP senior manager or delegate to revise those mitigation plans. So now that we've established the requirements of the standard, let's take a look at some potentially helpful resources. This is the SIP evidence request tool, and it can be found on the Texas Reliability Entity website, www.texasre.org, and can be filtered to show what will be requested of entities during a compliance audit. Here, you can see that for all applicable systems, entities will be asked to provide evidence of the release date of the patch, the date of the evaluation, the installation of the patch, or if the patch is not applied, evidence of a mitigation plan and any revisions. Note that even if no patches were released during the 35-day timeline, evidence that an evaluation of patches was completed will still be required. The link on this slide will take you to the compliance page on Texas RE's website, and from there, the evidence request tool can be found under the Entity Resources section. For a granular look at internal controls, you may want to look at NIST's Cybersecurity Framework version 2.0. The CSF breaks down high-level cybersecurity outcomes into 3 levels of increasing detail. It goes down to functions, and then categories, and then subcategories, and it provides supplemental resources to help organizations realize security objectives with actionable implementation examples. This is a great tool, and I can't recommend it enough. And if you download these slides, the link here will take you to the CSF 2.0 reference tool, where you can search specifically for those implementation examples based on need. Another great tool is the MITRE ATT&CK framework for industrial control systems. This is a knowledge base of adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures based on real-world cyber attacks against operational technology. It was initiated in 2020, and the MITRE ATT&CK framework provides insight into the behaviors and techniques of attackers, as well as data sources and mitigations for each technique. If we look at the highlighted techniques, we can see some of the ones related to patch management. They're examples like supply chain compromise, exploitation for evasion, and exploitation of remote services. But if you dig deeper within the attack framework, you'll find mitigation strategies for each of the techniques listed here. And that's all we have for patch management today. So we at Texas RE hope that we can be another helpful resource and are happy to answer any questions. And if you do have questions, feel free to reach us at compliance@texasre.org.